Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 150. The Demon Dentist. Part 2. If you haven't already done so, please go back to Part 1 so you have an understanding of Thomas Wainwright's early years and also what led to him being named as the Demon Dentist. This episode is going to cover his time in jail and also fill you in on family members and what became of them. Henry, in fact, did time in the lunatic asylum at Parramatta and then he was placed in Darlinghurst Jail. And it was not until 28 years later that Bertrand was released. He had proved to be a model prisoner, but it should be noted that he spent 4 years of that period in the asylum, and there was no doubt that he was ill-balanced, and the whole of his actions immediately after the murder of Kinder proved that. In Darlinghurst Jail, Bertrand developed an unexpected artistic talent. He painted watercolours, sculpted, he carved bone objects, played the organ for chapel services, and mentored the outlaw Frank Pearson, Captain Starlight from episode 135, and would show considerable talent as a painter. And his mother supplied him with paints, and he painted a life-size crucifix in his cell. One signed watercolour is titled Safer In Than Out, and it depicts a mouse in a cage with two dogs staring at it. The space they are in looks very similar to the sandstone cell in Darlinghurst Jail, and the buildings outside could be those in Burton Street outside the jail. The title of the drawing may have a double meaning, relating to the prisoners in the jail itself, rather than the animals. The two prisoners were together at Darlinghurst Jail at the same time. Pearson was only jailed for 11 years as opposed to Bertrand's 28, but they were both serving life sentences for murder and were of a similar age. Both were well educated, had some knowledge of Latin, and both had an interest in art and music. Bertrand and Pearson made the stained glass windows in the chapel of the Darlinghurst Jail. Bertrand also worked as a dentist in the hospital. On the 11th of January 1889 in the Armadale Express and New England General Advertiser, Henry L. Bertrand. The prisoner Henry L. Bertrand, who has now entered his 23rd year of imprisonment, was a few months ago removed from Maitland Jail to Darlinghurst. This removal was largely out of mercy to him, as latterly he has been developing bad traits, and to preserve him from punishment for misconduct, it was thought advisable to remove him. The authorities say that Bertrand should never be liberated, as according to their view, and to use a colloquial expression, he is a thoroughly bad egg. When the last appeal for his release failed, Bertrand threw off his mantle of pious remorse and became a troublesome customer. One of his schemes was the victimising of well-to-do relatives of prisoners. He would write letters, prison stiffs as they are called, to those relatives, saying he knew how to get their friends out, namely by bribing officials for good reports, and these people, in their anguish, would shell out to Bertrand's friends, notably his mother, recently deceased, whom he mainly supported in this way. It is strongly alleged that what will keep Bertrand within jail walls till he dies is the infamous and unpublished private memo, the book which he has kept, which alleged to have revealed a chain of startling rascalities perpetrated by him in his rooms in Hunter Street. H.L. Bertrand is sufficiently well known, with a sentence to suffer the most rigorous penalty of the law on March the 21st, 1886, for the most brutal and deliberately conceived murder of Henry Kinder at St Leonard's in 1865. The capital sentence was afterwards commuted to imprisonment for life by the Privy Council on the grounds of insanity, and Bertrand has kept in close confinement ever since. The murder forms one of the most remarkable cases in the criminal jurisprudence of Australia, and from the revolting circumstances attending it and the position held in society by the principal parties concerned, it is justly entitled to be considered one of the largest cases in criminal business. Henry Bertrand was released on the 17th of June 1894, and he was 53 at the time of his release. It says, there was a pathetic scene in the Darlinghurst Jail at 2 o'clock this afternoon when Mr. Hubert, the Governor, made known the decision of the Cabinet. Bertrand refused to believe the news. For years he'd hoped for a reprieve, But the time had passed on and he still remained a prisoner. As he began to despair, said the governor, "Bertrand, your reprieve has come at last. You are a free man." The criminal looked him steadily in the face, not a quiver in his features, and wore an expression which seemed to say, "Do not taunt me, there is no hope now." When, however, the truth of the declaration dawned upon him, he cried loudly. He attempted to speak, but the words stuck in his throat, and he fell to the ground in a deep faint, from which it took him some time to recover. Then he became excited, screaming out in delirious joy and shaking the hands of fellow prisoners, who congratulated him upon the reprieve, which at last has been granted. He was allowed to spend his first night of freedom at the Metropole Hotel. He gained his liberty on the condition that during the lifetime of a notable personage he would remain out of the colony, and this condition being fulfilled, he announces his intention to make an early visit with his sister to New South Wales, which he looks upon as his home. Since his release, Bertrand has received a share of the money by which his conviction was inherited solely by his sister. On the 18th of June 1894, although Bertrand has had a number of friends who take an interest in his welfare, yet as far as his immediate relatives are concerned, he may not expect sympathy. His wife still lives at Newtown, and his 2 children, who were quite young when he went into Darlinghurst and are growing up. None of them are likely to recognise him. Indeed, they have unvaryingly opposed his release. And on Wednesday, the 20th of June 1894, departure of Bertrand. The prisoner Henry Louis Bertrand, convicted in February 1866 of the murder of Mr. Kinder, the result of improper relations between the prisoner and his victim's wife, and sentenced to life, was liberated from jail and left by the Austral on Monday. A large number of Jewish friends and sympathisers were on the wharf to bid Bertrand farewell, but no demonstration of any kind took place. Bertrand was a second-class passenger, and he is now in comfortable circumstances in England. So it seems that Bertrand did not reconcile with his wife and children. The death notice for his mother also made no mention of her son. He kept a low profile for the rest of his life, and it was believed that when he arrived in London that he lived with a well-off aunt. He practised as surgeon-dentist under the name Edward Henry Burton in London in 1901, and he featured in the 1911 census in Portsmouth. Under the name of Burton, with his housekeeper Caroline Amelia Ladd, he moved to Portsmouth about 1902, and in 1909 she died after complaining she thought she was being poisoned. An inquest found that she died from natural causes, but is it possible that Henry reoffended? Henry Louis Bertrand, otherwise Burton, died on the 11th of September 1924 of senile decay and asthenia cardiac failure at Portsmouth. He was just a fortnight short of his 84th birthday. The 2 pistols, along with 2 pen holders carved by Bertrand during his prison term, can be seen in the Notorious Criminals exhibition that is at the Justice and Police Museum. Now, it did state in the newspapers that there were excerpts from his diary, the diary that they said didn't exist, and I'll just read some excerpts of it. His diary contains such extravagances as, "Thou art all I possess in this world and the next. Do not rouse the demon that I know lies dormant within me. Beware how you trifle with my love. I am no false slave to be played with or cast off as a toy. I am terrible in my vengeance. Terrible, for I call on the powers of hell to aid their master in his dire vengeance. God, what am I saying? I would not harm thee, not thy dear self, but only sweep away as with a scimitar my enemies." In another entry, "What work I have before my God only knows, but I will call on his love to help and strive to do right. I feel I shall. My dear devoted love shall save me. I know it will." In the train I borrowed half the Empire newspaper which contained this paragraph. "Francis Arthur Jackson convicted of sending a threatening letter to Henry L. Bertrand with intent to extort money, sentenced to 12 months hard labour. It has pleased me. I am satisfied. Thus once more perish my enemies." Again he wrote, "Poor fools to try and thwart my will. I who value human life as I value weapons to be used when required, then thrown away or destroyed. Some, of course, kept for future use, if necessary." And an entry in his diary on October the 26th after the murder said, "Lonely, lonely, lonely, she is gone and I am alone. Oh my God, did I ever think or dream of such agony? I am bound to appear calm. So much the worse. I do so hate all mankind. I feel as if every kindly feeling is gone with her. Ellen, dearest Ellen, I dare to thank God for the happiness of our last few months. Surely he could not forsake us and yet favour us, as he has done. Tears stream from my eyes. They relieve the burning anguish of my breaking heart. How shall I outlive 12 long months? Child, I love thee passionately and madly. I know not how much till thou were gone, and yet I am calm. This as the dead silence that preludes the tempest. What fierce passions are contending in my breast? Love, jealousy, revenge, hate, and unappeased rage. Can I ever be good? I will try, since my love wishes it. Dearest child, what I would not do for you, my wife in heart, soul, and spirit, angel of love, star that hath illumined my dark existence. I am grateful, ever grateful for the intense happiness you have caused me. O darling love, give me life faith, new sterling faith in thee. Thou art I possess both in life and in the next. Do not rouse the demon that I know lies within me. Beware how you trifle with my love. I am no base slave to be played with or cast off as a toy. I am terrible in my vengeance, terrible for what I call on the powers of hell to aid their master in dire vengeances. Henry Bertrand's family. His mother and sisters arrived on the ship Syria to Port Phillip Bay on the 22nd of December 1852, and this was prior to Henry emigrating. Marion then married Jewish dentist Louis Eskel in the Burke Street Synagogue in Melbourne on the 26th of May 1853. Louis had emigrated from London in October 1852. Marion had children with Louis, and in 1855 she went to London to visit. By 1861, Louis had 2 dental practices in Sydney. However, in July 1863, he was insolvent. In the insolvent estate of Louis Eskel, late of Hunter Street, Sydney dentist, and lately a confinee in Her Majesty's Jail, Darlinghurst. On the 21st of August 1863, insolvency in the estate of Louis Eskel. Take notice that I, Louis Eskel of Hunter Street, in the city of Sydney and in the colony of New South Wales, surgeon dentist, does intend to apply to His Honour the Chief Commissioner of Insolvency States, as the course of business will admit, for permission to release my estate from sequestrian. His total debts were £53 and his assets were only £5, so amount of deficiency was £48. By 1863, Louis and Marion had moved to Melbourne, where Louis had 2 dental practices. In November 1867, Marion returned from London, and in 1871, Marion was living in a rental property at Paran without Louis. By 1877, Louis was living and practising in Lancashire, England. Marion died on the 9th of April 1888 at Queenscliff, Victoria, at her residence Orwell College on the Esplanade, aged 71, and Louis died in England 2 years later. Marion also had a brother, Maris, who'd emigrated to Melbourne, and he was also a dentist, and he died in 1891. Henry's siblings. Alice was born on the 19th of July 1837 in Finsbury Circus, London. She was 14 when her mother and sisters emigrated to Australia. She married noted London architect John George Knight on the 21st of April 1853 in Melbourne when she was 16 and John 28. And a little on John George Knight. He was born in London. He was the son of John Knight, a stone and marble merchant. John took up engineering and then joined his father's firm, and in his spare time studied architecture. He arrived in Melbourne in February 1852, and after a week on the goldfields he joined the Public Works Department. While a government inspector he joined and later became a partner of the private practice of Thomas Kemp, and Peter Kerr later joined the practice and it became Knight and Kerr in 1855. In 1852 the government called for competitive designs for the House of Parliament and for Government House. Knight and Kemp's design for Government House won the first prize of £500, but the design was not used in the end. Knight was the founder of the Victorian Institute of Architects and was its first president from 1856 to 1861. Knight helped organise the Victorian Exhibition of 1861 and travelled to London in 1862 as Secretary for Victoria at the London International Exhibition. In March 1865, Knight was appointed lecturer in civil engineering at the University of Melbourne. In 1866, he had charge of the Melbourne Intercolonial Exhibition, and in 1867 organised Victoria's contribution to the Paris exhibition. John was one of the best-known inhabitants of the Northern Territory during the last 3 decades of the 19th century. He died in Darwin, which was at that time called Palmerston, on the 10th of January 1892, and he was the most senior official in the territory, the government resident. He arrived in the territory in 1873, and during his distinguished career he occupied a great variety of other posts. He was secretary and accountant to the government resident. He was architect, supervisor of works, goldfields warden, clerk of the court, deputy sheriff, special magistrate, crown prosecutor, official receiver, public trustee, and assistant returning officer. As an architect, he was responsible for the design of Palmerston's most substantial buildings, including extensions to Government House, part of the police station and courthouse, sections of Fanny Bay Jail, Browns Mart and the Town Hall. The Northern Territory Times reported that we cannot recall anything that created so universal a feeling of sadness as the decease of his honoured and honourable servant of the Crown and friend of the people, whose death marks a blotting out of noble life and perhaps the grandest landmark. The next day, flags at Palmerston were everywhere at half-mast, and public offices and businesses were closed as Knight's funeral cortege moved through the town. European, Chinese and Malays were all mingled together in vehicles, on horseback or walking. Even the Aboriginals, realising no doubt the full extent of the many kindnesses shown to them by the deceased, took this opportunity of testifying their gratitude. And on the 12th of January 1892, in the Bendigo Advertiser announces the death of J.G. Knight, death of government resident of the Northern Territory. The death is announced of Mr. J.G. Knight, a very old colonist and well known in Melbourne. He arrived in Victoria early in the 50s and was one of the firm Knight, Kemp and Kerr architects. He subsequently relinquished his profession and went to Palmerston, the capital of Northern Territory, and was appointed by the Adelaide government Chief Goldfields Warden and Police Magistrate, which position he occupied for many years. Upon the resignation of Mr. Parsons, the government resident, Mr. Knight was appointed and held this position until his death. He was of a very warm and genial disposition, and only a week ago his brother, Mr. G.W. Knight of Melbourne, received a most humorous letter from him, and he was therefore quite unprepared for this sudden blow. His career has been one of useful and progressive hard work. In his recent official position, he lost no opportunity in urging the construction of a transcontinental railway, which he deemed essential to the progress and prosperity of the great northern Australian continent, over which he had the honour to preside. The deceased gentleman had reached the age of 67 years. John and Alice had 9 children, 5 surviving into adulthood, and Alice died in New Zealand on the 5th of February 1905 at the age of 67, at the residence of her daughter, Mrs. Thomas Colpin. His second sister, Harriet Bertrand, was born in London in 1838. She married Knight's partner, Scottish architect Peter Kerr, on the 8th of August 1857. She was the one that had reported to the police of her brother saying that he did kill Henry Kinder. And on the 16th of May 1912, it says, by the latest exchange, we note the death of Mr. Peter Kerr, brother-in-law of Mr. Louis Eskell of Bunbury. Victoria loses one who has given to the city of Melbourne the most dignified and impressive of its architectural features. Mr. Kerr retired from public service 20 years ago and leaves a widow, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The eldest son, Mr. H.J. Kerr, is a district architect in the Department of Public Works, and Mr. C.H. Kerr is in business in Fremantle. For the last 30 years, Mr. Kerr has lived at Albert Park. On the 11th of February 1908, in the Melbourne Argus, the death is announced of Mrs. Peter Kerr. She arrived in Victoria in 1852 on the sailing ship Syrian. One of her grandsons, Corporal C.P. Kerr, enlisted with the Anzacs from New Zealand and is now on home service in Victoria. Another, Private C.G. Heber, enlisted in England with the artillery and is wounded in hospital. 2 other grandsons, Privates P.V. and C.E. Kerr, are with the AIF. Mrs. Harriet Kerr was 79 and died at her residence, Crescent House, Service Crescent, Albert Park, on the 10th of February. She leaves 2 sons and 2 daughters. One son, Henry J. Kerr, is a district architect in the Public Works Department. And the third sister, Josephine Rachel Bertrand, known as Joey, was born on the 4th of February 1843 at Mile End, Old Town, London. She married Charles Bright, a journalist and lecturer, in 1859 on the 7th of July at the house of the bride's brother-in-law, J.G. Knight, Esquire of Melbourne. They had 4 children. Josephine and Charles were divorced in 1883, and on the 19th of January 1883 it was announced in the New York Daily News. A well-known Australian journalist and lecturer in the Supreme Court today, Mrs. Josephine Bright was granted by Judge Donoghue an absolute divorce from her husband Charles Bright, and the custody of their children was awarded to her. Mr. Bright made no appearance or defence, though duly served with the papers. Mr. Bright is a lecturer from Australia who figured prominently as a speaker and lecturer at the Freethinkers Convention at Watkins Glen last summer. Josephine returned to live in London sometime before 1888 when her daughter Ethel was married in Melbourne, and Josephine died on the 27th of January 1917 in London, aged 73. And the announcement in the Melbourne Argus: Josephine Bright died in London, widow of the late Charles Bright, journalist, dearly loved sister of Mrs. Peter Kerr, loved auntie of Nellie Kerr Friedman and H.J. Kerr, architect, and councillor H. Charles Kerr of Fremantle, Western Australia, and Mrs. Gordon Heller, Matlock, Bath, Derbyshire, England. And Henry's half-siblings: Louis Philippe Esquel was born on the 25th of December 1853 in Melbourne. He married at the synagogue in Burke Street, West Melbourne, to Katie, second daughter of David Cohen, and he is listed as a surgeon-dentist from London. They had one son, Stanley Herbert Esquel, in March 1888 in Carlton, and his wife died on the 11th of August 1901 in Perth. It says, after a short illness, Katie Esquel, beloved wife of Louis Esquel, formerly of Melbourne, second eldest daughter of David Cohen of Tillingham Villas, Carlton. On the 16th of June 1905, it said, Mr. Louis Esquel, dentist, later 500 Hay Street, Perth, has arrived in Geraldton, where he intends to stay permanently to practice his profession. And Louis died on the 25th of March 1925 in St Kilda, Victoria. His second half-sibling, Annie May Sophia Esquel, was born on the 4th of May 1854 in London. She married Percy MacDonald Morris, a civil engineer, on the 16th of January 1889 in Melbourne. They had 3 daughters. By 1890, they were living in Argentina, and in 1901 moved to England. And Annie died on the 21st of November 1943 at Lincolnshire, England. The third, Frederick Moses Esquel, was born on the 6th of September 1858 in Melbourne. He married Rosa Teresa Marion Burton in 1883 in Melbourne. On the 18th of April, they married at the bride's mother's residence at St Kilda. And on the 5th of January 1884, it announces the dissolution of partnership between Louis Philip Esquel and Frederick Morris Esquel, carrying on business as surgical and mechanical dentists in Collins Street, under the style and firm of Esquel, which was dissolved by mutual consent. Mr. Louis Esquel will carry on the business in Collins Street, and Mr. F.M. Esquel will carry on business at a different address in Collins Street. So they've separated to have their own dental surgeries. And on the 30th of June 1892, in the Rockhampton Daily Northern Argus, alleged embezzlement, a peculiar partnership affair. At the City Court yesterday, William Davidson was charged with embezzling the sum of £112, the property of Frederick Esquel, a member of the firm Esquel and Davidson. Mr. Smith opened the case and said there were peculiar circumstances surrounding it. Mr. Esquel and the accused entered into a partnership to start a business in Brisbane as dentists. The prosecutors supplied the material necessary for starting the business and expended £200. In the partnership agreement, Davidson had no power to draw money out of the bank. Mr. Esquel, however, had behaved very liberally to his partner. After the business had been started, for some months the accused wrote to Mr. Esquel for more money, despite the fact that the business was not flourishing. Mr. Esquel refused to send any more money as he'd already sunk in a large sum, and the accused wrote stating that he could not carry the business on any longer. Mr. Esquel then replied, telling the accused to return the furniture to a man named Myers and to come on to Melbourne. The accused, instead of following instructions, disposed of the furniture and dental materials, valued at £116, for £45. On the 6th of April, Davidson arrived in Melbourne and could not offer a satisfactory explanation of the way in which he carried on the business. County Court proceedings were instituted against the accused, but were subsequently withdrawn as it was decided to proceed on a criminal charge. Mr. Croker contended that the court had no jurisdiction to hear a criminal charge, which took place in Brisbane. Mr. Panton said, "I don't think any jury would take time to consider the case on the account of the civil action previously taken. It looks like a last shot." The case was adjourned, and then on the 17th of June 1892, Mr. Panton said he carefully studied the evidence and had concluded that the prosecutor had failed to make out his case, and he would therefore unhesitatingly dismiss the charge. The accused had always borne a good character, and his explanation of the transactions appeared to be thoroughly truthful and trustworthy. His explanation was quite satisfactory. The accused was discharged. And then on the 8th of June 1894, there was a dissolution of a partnership between Frederick Eskell and Arthur Mackey, dentists of King William Street, Adelaide, trading as Eskell and Mackey. The business is now carried on by Frederick Eskell and Thomas Tattersall under the name Fred Eskell and T. Tattersall. In 1900, Fred purchased land at Chillago in Queensland. His wife died in 1909 and Frederick married again to Margaret Eleanor Griffiths, née Turton, in Melbourne in 1912, and Frederick died on the 24th of October 1921 at Clinique St Joseph in Bruges, Belgium. And his wife, Jane Palmer King, was born in October 1844 in England and arrived with their parents to Sydney on the 27th of December 1852 on the Wilson Kennedy as assisted immigrants. In 1903 and 1904, she was living at Newtown, New South Wales, with Arthur Biggs, a clerk, and his wife, Edith, who was Jane's niece, the daughter of her older sister, Margaret. In 1904, she moved to Auckland with her children. In 1905, she listed herself as a widow, living at Waitemata, Auckland, New Zealand. From 1911, she was living with her son and daughter-in-law in Devonport. And Jane died on the 25th of August 1922 in Devonport, Auckland, New Zealand, aged 77. And their children, Alice Mary Bertrand was born on the 18th of February 1864 in Sydney. She married John Davis, an Englishman upholsterer, in Marrickville in 1891. They had 4 children, 2 that survived infancy, and by 1893 they'd moved to New Zealand. Alice died on the 7th of August 1929 at her residence in Palmerston North, New Zealand, aged 65. And Henry Louis Bertrand was born on the 5th of May 1865, only 5 months before the court case and the events with Henry Kinder. In 1896, Henry was living in Napier, Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, and working as a clerk. His sister Alice and her husband also lived at Napier at this time. In 1898, he married Mary Gibson and they had 5 children, and Henry died on the 6th of June 1947 at Devonport, New Zealand, aged 82. And what became of Mrs. Kinder? In 1866, Mrs. Kinder found it expedient to immigrate to New Zealand, where she engaged herself as a barmaid at a hotel and remarried. Ellen Kinder married Humphrey Minchin Carden in Greymouth, West Coast, New Zealand on the 29th of May 1867. They also briefly lived in Auckland, just down the road from the house of Reverend John Kinder, who had charge of Ellen Kinder's children, Harry Ellen and Fanny Nestor. Ellen and Humphrey had 2 children together, one in September 1867 and a stillborn daughter, whilst en route to San Francisco in Peru in July 1868. Ellen's family had moved to San Francisco previously, and that's where Ellen died in 1883, aged only 40. And in the end, Henry outlived all those involved, his wife and his mistress. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.